space, so she's been supporting a number of organisations, specifically Salford City Council. And Eva, you're passionate about demystifying digital transformation and engaging business leaders and employees in change. And today's session, we're going to be looking at how we can...
Cash.
Yeah.
Really sorry to interrupt.
Okay.
On mine, it doesn't look as if it's recording. Can you just check?
It is recording.
Yeah, it's all right. Sorry to interrupt.
Recording. And like with all our webinars, we are going to be recording these. We're going to be sharing them back to you. And please, if there is a question, raise your hand. And myself and the team at Northwest Employers, I can see a couple of you online smiling away there. We will facilitate. I will facilitate some of the questions, but please ask those questions. And actually, the focus of the webinar this afternoon is looking at managing remotely. How do you manage remotely? How do you manage work and life? And in the original discussions that we were having with Eva, it was almost like, how do you do this homeschooling working thing? And actually, what we're going to focus in on is actually work and home, and how do you make that work? So hopefully, colleagues that are on this afternoon, and for those of you that are watching this on repeat, will get a real flavour of what's going on out there. But I think without further ado, I will hand over to Eva, and yeah, looking forward to hearing and learning from you.
Thank you, Cash. So just in terms of just before I start. I'll just say again, if anyone, if people feel comfortable putting their cameras on, I'm kind of scrolling through just to kind of see people's faces, so I can get a little bit of a sense if I'm boring you, or a bit of feedback. If you have any questions or any reactions, feel free to use the chat, because I think Pat and Cash will be kind of monitoring what's going on there. And while I'm talking, I may not necessarily be able to pay attention, but they'll probably feed back to me. And I think I've set it up so everybody's mics are on mute, but we'll try and have maybe some questions and stuff, at which point I'd say almost like 99% of the time when I ask a question, I forget I'm on mute. So I'm just reminding everyone to then unmute yourself. And I am going to attempt to share my screen, which of course, we'll see if this works. Yeah, okay. And let me see if this works. Oh, no, sorry. See, I knew that this would be this is the one bit that would be, here we go. Okay, so everyone should be able to see my screen, and you may also be able to see some people on the side. And if you want to go into chat or anything while this is going on, I'm kind of assuming most people do use Zoom, but if not, you can find the chat at the bottom. So so Cash and Pat asked me if I would do a talk for them on sort of these very strange times that we're living in. And when I sat down to write this, or to think about what I wanted to share with you, I actually realized that I don't think I've fully made sense of everything yet. So instead, I thought I'm going to focus on sort of the four main thoughts, or the four main themes that have been going around in my head over the last month or so. And so I'm going to be sharing these four thoughts with you, and really interested also to hear how your feedback on this. But the first one is, I was asked, like, what can I talk to you about remote working? And the very first thing that keeps going back and forth in my head is that what we're experiencing now is not really remote working, right? What we're experiencing now is forced working from home during a global crisis. And I want to make that distinction, because we can make a lot of assumptions about how we are set up as organizations to work remotely based on the experience now, but a lot of that data will be incorrect, because really what we're dealing with is something much bigger than remote working. So we're in a situation right now where, in general, we've got people who have low morale. We're going to have lower productivity. We've got increased issues of stress and mental health. People being triggered in terms of the mental health. We've got well-being down. People are distressed in many, many, many ways, whether it's kind of in the day-to-day feeling claustrophobic being at home all the time, or whether it's the thinking about the future and the sort of existential threat of all of this in the future. So these are difficult times. And it's so important to reframe this as fundamentally what we're dealing with is a crisis where we are working from home rather than how do we work remotely? Because if you were to ask me that 6 months ago, I would probably have a completely different presentation. And I found this this was kind of interesting because this is fairly recent data from Josh Bersin, who works out of the US. I think he used to do work with Deloitte, but he did sort of a pulse survey on what are the top issues on employees' minds. He also looks at what are organizations focusing on in HR. But I thought this is really interesting that, you know, if you kind of summarize it at the bottom, it says top 4 issues that employees are thinking about right now. It's number 1, financial security, because we know that there's going to be some potentially big economic blowback because of this, health and well-being, their family, and work and productivity is really down at the bottom. So again, we have to kind of imagine that we're operating in a world where, you know, people are, we're fortunate that people can focus on work where they can. It's not necessarily going to be the top thing on people's minds because we are fundamentally in a crisis. So what is it that, but, you know, thinking about all this, what is it that you or the leaders in your organization and your, you know, in your business, what is it that you can actually do to kind of address this? And I think the first one that I want to kind of give to you to consider is that a lot of you will probably have ongoing projects or programs that are looking at the future of work and how we have more virtual working and how we can be more agile in working and everything else. And whilst this is absolutely giving you some evidence and some data about that, please do not jump to any conclusions right now about remote working, because this as a test case or as a use case is too confused with all of the other kind of stresses of what's happening with the pandemic. And so you can absolutely learn from this. And I think that some of the learnings will be around what technology works, how robust your systems are, et cetera, in terms of ways of working and how people are able to adjust to it, or kind of behaviors around it. I think that I would hold judgment on that until we're out of this particular period of time. The other thing that it seems kind of really obvious, and I'm assuming most of you are probably doing this, but it's really good to re-emphasize, you know, this is a time where we need to prioritize checking in with how people are feeling, because as we've seen from that data, there's a lot of emotion and there's a lot of fear and worry going on. So this has to be the priority really right now, and it will continue to have to be the priority until, you know, we move into whatever the next phase is, and then we're still going to have to do it about how people feel in the next phase. And I also would say, you know, let's remember the idea of sort of the change curve, right? That at certain points of time, we may feel differently about what's going on, or your people may feel differently about it, which is why we have to constantly check in. And I can say myself that probably in the early weeks of lockdown, I was actually felt quite energized in a strange way. And I was, you know, very productive and getting lots done. And I've definitely in the last week or so hit a big lull where I'm, you know, I find it much more difficult. I'm really having to drag myself through the day. On the contrary, one of my colleagues in the early days, he shared a diary entry with me that said he feels like all of his energy has been sucked out. Today, he said, actually, he's feeling really good and he's kind of made peace with it. So we're all going to be at different points of time, and we're all going to be going through those emotions. And just because you've checked in with your team or you've checked in with your reports or your colleagues and they've said they're fine, a couple of weeks later, they may not be, and vice versa. And in terms of checking in, I was thinking that I could give you something really simple. Now, I'm just going to make sure that I can see the chat when I do this. You know, really easy. We do lots of video calls. we probably speak to our team or speak to our colleagues every day. How are we feeling today? Out of 10, can you see my hands here? Which I've got to, you know, a really easy check-in is like, I'm feeling a 5, I'm feeling a 3, I'm feeling a 2, a 1, whatever. And these are simple things that we can do. And it also, so we've got, I'm trying to see the people, some of the people here, we've had some, yeah, so, you know, 6s, 5s, whatever. And it really simply gives you a sense of how people are doing, because also you can be on a call and people can be smiling, and then you can say, how are you feeling today? And they can go a 3, and you'll know, actually, that's someone that maybe I need to pick up the phone and have a one-to-one conversation with. And also, as you guys have done in the chats, you know, you can even have this as a chat just at the beginning or the end of a meeting. How are we feeling? We write a number down, and it gives you a pulse, right, of where people are. Equally, on weekly basis, I would say that we should be asking more in-depth questions, right? So what went well this week? And let's focus also on what we're happy about, what we can celebrate every week. What was difficult? So let's make it safe for us to kind of address the things that didn't work. And maybe let's make some sort of a commitment about something that we could try next week or something we can do next week to see if we can improve either of those things. And again, I would say this is something that we should start making a rhythm of over these periods of time, right? And finally, I think, again, I'm assuming that probably all of you, this is second nature to you, but, you know, take the time to ask and to follow up with individuals, with your teams. How are they feeling? What's going on? Do you understand their situations, etc.? And make sure that it happens on a regular basis. Now, that's kind of the biggest frame that I wanted to put around this was just, you know, let's not forget that this is a pandemic, not a working remote exercise in future of work. I really I'm trying in all of my conversations to reframe this so that we don't forget that there's a lot of kind of emotional stuff, and there's a lot of fear and worry and anxiety that's under the surface. And again, I think probably all of you are aware of this, but I think we have to build it into how we're working during this time. Now, Kash, do you want to, I'm gonna move on to kind of my next theme, but is there anything that you want to kind of question or any questions?
Yeah, I think so. So yeah, thanks, Eva. That it's a really, really interesting frame, and it's certainly something that we in our team have been thinking about. And I think what's really telling from the messages so far is around don't jump to conclusions. However, there is still learning in that for us. So really interesting thing you just said there about actually in the first, when this whole crisis started, you had a lot of energy. And I think in our team, we saw that some people had a lot of energy, others didn't. And it's almost everybody's is where they are on the change curve. Is there a way in which you can perhaps, how can we capture some of this learning for us for now so that we can use it in the future? Or is what we're saying actually a lot of this won't be relevant, but then it might be if for example, homeworking becomes a thing, you know, that's where my head is at with it.
Yeah. So I mean, I think a lot of this is, what I think is that we are definitely learning a lot about working remotely, but we're doing it under extreme duress, right? So we can, you know, you'll see some big statements right now about this proves that actually we don't need an office, or, you know, this proves that we can't work remotely, you know, on either extreme. And I think that, you know, I would say you can't come to any definitive conclusion during this time, because the circumstances are going to overpower any of the data that you're going to collect about working remotely. And telling as well is the fact that I've spoken to a lot of people who work in organizations that have incredibly strong remote working culture, some of which actually work entirely distributed and entirely remotely. And they're feeding back that they're finding this time very difficult. Their productivity's gone down. They're struggling. So, you know, it's that there are two things going on. Now, one thing is that I think it's a huge benefit that we've got a lot of people onto the kind of digital tools and technology that we've been wanting to nudge them on for many years. And they're going to gain a familiarity with it because they've been forced to. And in a way, that's brilliant, because then that no longer is a barrier in the future, right? Getting people onto the tools, but do they understand the tools? Yes, they use them. We all know how to use chat and Zoom now. We all know how to log in. We're not scared of that anymore. But you know, but have we actually really thought through, you know, how we're making remote working effective and productive? And do we have the right ways of working around it? And do we have the right structures and the right ways of defining, you know, the way that we do the work that we do and our tasks and everything? We don't have that. We've been sort of forced into this. So I think that we will have to roll back some things in order to design them better to move forward in the, you know, in the future, when we are out of the kind of immediate sort of fight and flight kind of stage that we're in right now, or what you called before the forming kind of stage that we're in right now, where things are really unclear and things are very uncertain.
And I think from a manager's perspective, it's almost, if you were not doing the daily, weekly check-ins, now it's almost that now's a good time to, if you haven't done them before, start doing them. And the what was difficult this week, again, that is something that people struggle to perhaps share in a for example a team meeting anyway, and I'm wondering whether they're more likely to share that in a digital sense. It's almost that removal that you have when you're not there in person, might mean that people are more up for sharing some of that.
Yeah. Well, the other thing too, I think is very interesting is that, you know, everybody knows that we're all going through difficult times. So in a way, there's no shame in saying that you're having a 3 or a 4 day, right? Whereas prior to this, if I were to ask a group, like, how are you feeling? The chances that they would feel safe enough to say that would be lower. So I think it's interesting that the fact that it's such a shared experience actually does make it feel safer for us to admit, you know, that we're struggling with it. And the other thing, sorry, before I forget and move on, the other thing I think, where you were asking about how can we capture learnings, I think that in those weekly check-ins, right, writing down or capturing what's working and what's not working and what do we want to do different next week is the learning that accumulates over time, and you will start to see what the patterns are of how it's going to work in this situation, and then you can start to figure out how to apply it, you know, when this situation changes.
Because everybody's context will be totally different. Well, you might have, like, you know, you've got a family where you've got 3 kids and 1 adult, or 2 adults are both trying to hold a job down, and it's almost that there are lots of different ways and scenarios. And I thought the first slide that you showed around the pulse check, the top issues, I think, yeah, I can see why that is the way it is, because for a lot of people, job security is number 1, followed by their own health, followed by, okay. I'm just looking at the chat, and there are not any questions. Okay. Pat's probing. And
so I'm going to move on to my second thing, because it segues really well into it.
Okay.
Which is that, you know, this is really the crux of the first point, is that for some of us, our remote working situation is going to be very challenging. And I would actually venture to say for all of us it is. And we, you know, we're hearing, I mean, in a way, this is now our work and our home lives are colliding. They're not balanced. We're not, you know, trying to create a blended kind of lifestyle or whatever. We're actually just being forced to kind of warts and all now be at home while we work. And this is, you know, this is why this is not necessarily remote working, because in a remote working situation where you are thinking strategically about how you're going to roll out remote working, if somebody does not have a suitable situation from working from home, you don't force them into it, right? Whereas now we're all forced into it. I've been collecting these. I think they're really great. So I've been collecting some of these people, like discussing from the parents' point of view, what the last few weeks or last month has been like. This is, you know, Krishnan Gurumurthy, who's from Channel 4. Homeschool and working from home are not compatible. tears, tantrums, non-stop expletives, and that's just me. I'm actually finding myself anxious because it starts again tomorrow. Probably other people who have school-age children can relate to this, or you've heard your colleagues kind of discussing this. And I love this one from a few days ago. Somebody like very earnestly reaches out. I actually know him, lovely, lovely chap. Parents, now that you're a few weeks in, what actually works and what did you think would work but doesn't in terms of working from home with kids? And somebody just beautifully answered, what works is having a state-funded universal education system where you can send your kids to a safe place and they're taught by people whose job it is to do so while you do your own job. What doesn't work is not doing. I think that's the, you know, that is why I'm saying that this is not exactly remote working. But interestingly, you know, I think it's very obvious in some sense that the challenges or the struggles that people with younger kids are having at home. But equally, people who are home alone are struggling, are also having a lot of challenges. I've got a lot of friends here in London who live alone, and I think their feelings of sort of despair in terms of isolation and loneliness is, you know, really, it's really affecting me hearing how they're feeling. I know people who have physical problems with their physical spaces where they don't really have anywhere that they feel comfortable working, or they have issues with the Wi-Fi, or, you know, there's one quiet room, but the Wi-Fi doesn't work there, so I've got to go somewhere that's busy. I know people who live with flatmates, and, you know, you think it's hard to live with flatmates before this. When you're stuck in isolation with flatmates, you know, it really brings out a lot of tension. So, you know, we all are having challenges, right? And I think I wrote some people maybe, you know, some of people's work life or work home situation may be really challenging. I would probably edit that to say, well, all of our work home situations are challenging right now. So again, what can you do, or what can your leaders do to help with this? Well, I think this is just such an obvious one, but if you haven't been doing this already, I think we all have to be very open about our own challenges, and we have to be asking our leaders and our senior leaders to be very open with theirs, because in sharing, I think, is where we actually start to just take some of the pressure and bring humanity back into the situation. And so, you know, starting by just talking about yourself, or getting your board to talk about themselves and how they've been feeling, I think it's actually a really good opportunity as well, to bring some human, authentic kind of communications into your organization. And it's a big deal, a big challenge, I think, for leaders who don't normally like to be personal or don't normally like to admit the things that are not going well. But I think this is the opportunity here. The other thing is, you know, do make sure, you know, this is probably obvious, and I'm kind of assuming that a lot of you will have done this already, or most of you will have done this already, but make sure you do know what everyone's situation is and what they may need. And I'd imagine there are a lot of programs in place that are kind of dealing with this in different ways. But again, going back to the other point and continually checking in with that and making sure that that situation hasn't changed, deteriorated, you know, there's not people who are struggling in different ways over time. I found this and I thought it was a really nice thing to share with you. I know the woman who put this together, specifically for parents, thinking about the kinds of things that you can do to support parents who are trying to work from home right now. And some of the suggestions in here, you know, some of them are again, obvious, you know, trusting people, understanding that they're going to be trying their best, acknowledging the discomfort that, you know, again, we've all now seen each other, we've all met each other's dogs, cats, flatmates, children, whatever. You've seen each other in our pajamas. What more is there, right? But I think in this, there was some really nice suggestions, some of which, you know, we can't necessarily, not every business would be able to do, but I love this suggestion of sending gifts to the kids, or thinking about what the organization could give back to these children to kind of make them, you know, they are involved in our work life now. They do see what we do. Can we as organizations give something back to them? And the other thing is, you know, in some cases you may have to be thinking about things like job sharing, or restructuring days or reduced hours. And I know a lot of people are moving to that in order just to manage, where say, particularly if there's two working parents with multiple kids, maybe one parent works half a day, the other parent works the other half a day, and that's just how they have to manage. In terms of non-parents, but people who may be feeling isolated, I think a lot of organizations have been doing a lot of social activities online to sort of help manage that isolation. And there's some brilliant things. There's, I know a team that does on Friday mornings, they do, instead of their Friday morning meeting, they do PE with Joe together. I know other teams that have Friday afternoon shared drinks. You can do games, quizzes, you can have fancy dress parties. I mean, there's lots of really fun things that you can do to try and keep that emotional social engagement up. And the other thing is to try and enable a system of peer coaching where people are getting support from each other, or they're kind of being able to lean on each other. But this is kind of the big point that I wanted to make around this, that we're paying a lot of attention to flattening the curve. But I think that when we think about flattening the curve, I think we need to accept that part of that actually means reduced productivity. And I don't think that there's any way around that, because again, all of us are stressed out for different reasons and not able to be as productive or as efficient as we normally would be. So kind of accepting that and acknowledging it and bringing it to the senior team and sort of bringing it down into the management teams, that productivity is going to be reduced. What is it we need to concentrate on? Do we have enough people to do it? Do we need extra resources to do it? There's certainly a lot of people right now who are out of work. You know, how are we going to manage it? We can't expect the same kind of efficiencies that we would have normally. And the last thing I kind of thought as a challenge, and I don't know, I'd love to hear if anyone's actually done this, but for those of you who kind of do track time or monitor time or track weeks or plan weeks, you know, adding like free time or parenting time or queuing for bread, queuing for eggs time, you know, into your working day, and actually making that part of, this isn't something that I have to spend 8 hours in front of my computer on a video screen and then I have to run over to Lidl and wait 2 hours to get into a queue to buy eggs. Actually, I'm just going to take 2 hours out of the day to do that, because that's what it takes to buy eggs now. And again, I've been speaking to some people where they have they've said to everyone, there's 2 hours every day that you have to do, you know, whatever it is you need to do. And this is an organization where the average age is probably like late 20s, early 30s. So it's not parenting, it's just, you know, getting stuff done in the day that you need to do. And I think that, again, we can kind of give ourselves a bit of permission to say that we are going to need extra time in our days, and we can't load it up with work all the time. So that's my, oops, I'll go back for a sec. That's my next kind of thought that I'm sharing with you.
Yeah.
Cash, do you have any thoughts or?
Quite a bit of dialogue on the old chat there, if you have a look. So a couple of people have talked about keeping a routine when you're not actually working, so you still have a sense of purpose. And Janet, I completely relate to knowing what day of the week it is. It almost feels like that period between sort of Christmas and New Year, where you think, what day is it? Is it Wednesday? What's the date? I've no idea. When's New Year? So it almost feels like that on a perpetual basis. Helen has talked about not having a commute to switch off and give distance between work. So, you know, for most of us, the commute might involve, a shuffle down the corridor, or, another room, or for some, it might just be like literally at the end of your bed, whatever. So I think that what we underestimate is that that social distance, that kind of mental distance. And then Janet's come back with a couple of other prompts around giving yourself permission to have a break when you're working. I mean, we have our team has several meetings, and we almost we have to sometimes give ourselves permission to go make a brew, and then somebody's put in. It's a really good challenge here. Supporting an employee who doesn't want that level of communication, so prefers non-verbal as opposed to video calls. So again, if that isn't your preference, and again, I'm reflecting when you asked at the beginning of the session, can everybody show their video? Maybe not everybody wanted to, and and that's okay, I guess, isn't it, Eva?
Yep. Yeah, and that's why I always say, like, if you don't feel comfortable for whatever reason, please don't feel obligated. But and I think so. In that example, I think what I did, and hopefully this was picked up on, is that I said why it's nice for me if you show the video, because then as I'm talking, I can see people's faces and I can kind of gauge, you know, that I'm, at least I can feel like I'm not just speaking into a screen. But equally, if you don't feel comfortable for any reason, please don't feel obligated to do it. And I think just having that kind of transparency with your team about why you're using certain communications, also reflecting yourself on why you're using it, what the purpose of it is, why you think it's the best channel to use, and then giving them the option to not use it, is probably the best we can do right now. I was thinking that I heard somebody say something the other day, which was just so insightful, which is that useless meetings are just as useless on video conferencing, and I think we forget that sometimes, because of the novelty fact that that we're not in a meeting room. You know, we kind of forget that sometimes maybe the meeting is not needed. But equally, we may want those meetings just so that we can see each other's faces and kind of feel connection again, because we may be feeling lonely. So sort of understanding what the purpose of the meeting is and what you're going to get out of it is a good steer. But the other thing too, I think that we're probably over relying, I'd imagine, on video calls. I'm hearing just so much time is being spent on video calls, and the problem with that is that it not just forces people to receive information in the same way, but it also forces them to receive it at the same time, where again, as we've talked about in the kind of weird things that we're having to juggle in a day, it may be that at that time you're too distracted to be able to absorb the information, which is why I think we have to start making sure, especially if we're going to be in lockdown for at least another month or so, that we figure out how to really effectively use the other communication channels. So chat that is not synchronous, ways to collect tasks or to kind of collect information that we're all sharing so that we can kind of get visibility, but that we're not having to rely on being face-to-face to do it. And I think that tends to be a bit more difficult. So I'm not hearing as much creativity or as much kind of experimenting with that as I am hearing about how we're experimenting with video.
Can you also share with us that I really like the infographic that you presented around how organizations can support parents, and also you know, any ideas that you might have, or anything that you might have come across around online social activities, because again, you know, doing a fancy dress team meeting sounds hilarious, I think, and you could get the kids involved, I guess, but then drinks and games and quizzes, and you know, there's lots and lots of different ways, is what you're saying, of building that connection with your team through a digital means, isn't there?
Yeah, I'll see if I can find some good stories, and I'll send it back to you to share around to people.
Wonderful.
Good. So I'm going to go on to my next thought. This is number 3 thought for this afternoon. And this is that really the most important role for leaders right now is to communicate. And we need to make sure that we're doing it right, you know. And so in that, I think, sorry, I'm just going to close chat because it's right in the middle of my screen. You know, like, if nothing else, this is actually the role of leaders, right? Is to step into the role of providing calm and clarity during uncertainty. This is really what leaders are there for, because when things are certain and they're running along fine and everything else, it's their role is not as obvious as times like now, right? And you know, what the kind of the problem with that is that often we forget how to communicate, like what is the real communication style or communication persona, right, that we need when our role is fundamentally to just try and create that sense of clarity and calm in the midst of chaos. And that is that, you know, we have to communicate with openness, with compassion, and we have to be human. And this is how, you know, by doing so, this is actually how we help people feel more comfortable with the unknown. We can't necessarily give them answers, but we can give them a sort of empathy and human sharing, right? That calms them down and just makes them accept the situation that they're in. And this is, I think, really the paradox with a lot of leaders, is that we forget this, and we think that our role is to have the answers, right? Or we think that our role is to kind of make the decisions and just move things forward. And I think that we really see that difference between the communicating in order to soothe, right, versus communicating in order to kind of solve problems and be very pragmatic. We see that a lot with the world leaders right now, where I'm sure, you know, you will have seen over the last week or so, there've been a lot of articles kind of noting that some of the global leaders have done really beautifully in this crisis. One of which being the Prime Minister in New Zealand, who Jacinda Ardern, who talks with a lot of kind of vulnerability and humility and emotion, and she's very compassionate and she's very kind of caring in the way that she speaks. Angela Merkel has also been sort of cited as someone who's doing this very well. I think that actually the articles we're talking about, the women leaders tend to be better at this. This is not, I'm not going to get into a kind of a, you know, whether there is a gender correlation or not, but maybe female leaders have honed this style of communication better. And what really struck me was that we keep kind of referring to like wartime situation, and this is like being in the war, but actually I think fundamentally everybody seems to be saying that actually they don't really want to be like rallied and bolstered and stuff. They want to be soothed, right? And right now actually what we want is to just feel kind of safer and calmer, and that things are happening and that we're going to be able to manage, rather than like, come on, we're going to do it. And the world leaders who are forgetting to bring that compassion and empathy in the way that they speak, I think are not being as effective as the ones who are. So just again, a reminder to us as leaders or as managers or for other leaders that, you know, we have to start thinking about this being the fundamental of our communications, as well as the information that we need to convey. And if you have people who you know are better at communicating in this way, try and use them more. But the other thing is, of course, frequency and openness, because as we know, in turbulent times, silence is filled with fear and conjecture and suspicion, right? So we need to be kind of as open and as transparent as possible. But, you know, it's equally hard, because I think this is a kind of a rule that most people know, but then they overfill, they sort of over communicate to a way that then we become inundated with information, but we haven't necessarily fulfilled the emotional need of the communication, nor have we filled the sort of sense-making need of the communication. So that, again, this balance between making sure that we're being transparent and we're communicating openly and we're giving people as much information as we possibly can, whilst not just giving them the information and the data without any of the synthesis or sense making, or without the kind of compassion or the empathy that goes with it. So somebody gave me a really nice quote, which I thought was kind of a good example of this, where she said that she thinks her role right now is to be honest about where things are, what we know and what we don't know. And she thinks her role is to be a common trusted figure to provide clarity. And what she's trying to do at all times is say things like, well, this is what we know, this is what we don't know, and this is what we're going to do. And I'm sorry I don't have all the answers, but I promise I'll share them with you when I do. And again, you think that's a very powerful, difficult thing for some leaders to be able to say, that they don't have the answers and they don't know. So again, just checking in and reminding us of that. And So I've kind of given you a couple questions to think about for yourself or people in the leaders in your organization. The first one is, are you accessible? Are you providing support and compassion even if you can't provide certainty? Are you sharing as much as you can, working in the open? And are you being human and empathetic when you speak? So are you bringing your kind of own experience or your own emotions into it? We can, again, this is one of these things that, depending on where you sit in the organization, or you know, who you are supporting, or who you're managing, this is something that you could maybe check in with yourself on a regular basis. You could give yourself a score every week, right? Just to sort of say where I think, you know, how I think I've done this week, or you can ask, you can get feedback from other people. But also with the feedback, I think really important that we ask the people who we are directly dealing with, you know, what is it that you need from me? What should I start or continue doing each week? And having, again, in those weekly check-ins, just these questions, so that you can figure out how you reorientate yourself or how you're engaging with your teams. I'm interested if there are any thoughts on this one.
There's a bit of a link between what you said here about communicating and making sure you do it in the right way, and what you talked about in the previous thought, which was authenticity. And I think you can't be authentic unless you know the situation that your people might be in. And at the same time, just as you were saying, the quote, I thought, you know, that quote was really good. But saying "I don't know" is okay when you don't know. And a number of leaders that certainly I've come across almost want to have the answer,
yeah. And
when they don't have the answer, that's where the silence comes in. So there is, I think that what we're saying here is that it's actually communication, and communication in the right way is a really important part of managing what we're trying to manage right now. Just want to put it back to because I'm just looking, we've got 31 people on at the moment. I don't know if there's any kind of, just maybe share some reflections, perhaps, if there's anything that you want to share as part of this exercise, because I think the other thing I liked, Eva, was the rallied versus soothed. That was quite an interesting difference, isn't it? It's almost like when you get rallied, you kind of, it's high energy, but then you run out of energy, and then what do you do? Whereas soothed feels a bit more nicer, but also a bit more sustainable.
Yeah. Well, I think it was interesting. I was speaking to a friend who works in a, you know, big commercial, like right at the sharp end of this crisis in terms of their commercial situation, and she said that she really noted that the types of leaders that they have there, and you know, the very senior levels, they tended to be these like big alpha bombastic characters who would go out and like, you know, that rallying was their style. And yet in the last month, they've been fronting the people who spoke quietly and calmly and slowly, and that those were the people that everyone wanted to hear from. They didn't want to hear from the other characters. And I do think, you know, there's a need that we forget, but then also there's a skill, or there's a kind of a style that we like, let these leaders step into the foreground right now, because actually I think that we really appreciate hearing from them. Yeah,
I'm just seeing one of Sharon's comment there about actually knowing your people. So some will want to be rallied, others will want to be soothed, and it's just knowing which one's going to work in that situation. So yeah, thanks, Sharon.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly too, if you think about, if you're in that low energy kind of a mode, then maybe actually you do need people to be a bit like, come on, we can do this. But I guess that, again, if you're doing it because you're paying attention to the people, it means that you're doing it from a human, empathetic place, rather than just that's the only style that you know and that's the only thing that you're going to fall back on. So I'm going to move on to my last point, so that I can let you guys go and enjoy the rest of your Tuesday afternoon. But again, dead obvious statement here, but working remotely takes tools. But what I meant by that may be slightly differently. from what we generally think about when we say tools. Yes, we need all the tech, absolutely. But there's a lot of other things that we need in order to effectively work remotely. We need all of this kind of mutual understanding of what are the needs of the people, what are their situation, how do they work well, do they want to be soothed or rallied? We need the right kind of rituals and routines so that we don't kind of drift apart, whilst, so that being disparate and decentralized doesn't also mean chaotic and kind of moving away from each other. We need to have full visibility and shared goals so that we know what we're working towards. We definitely need clearly defined tasks. And this is, funnily enough, one of the things that I think a lot of teams that are not used to working remotely struggle with, that they aren't breaking their work down into chunks and knowing that what they're going to deliver at each point in time. So they become very lost without the structure. And then we need those effective ways of working, which I think we've talked about a lot over the last almost hour now. I'm going to give you just a few examples of tools. I'm not going to go into great detail with them, but there's a lot of things that are actually just around, say, a team, right? This is called a team canvas. So as a team, have you ever sat down and kind of written out what is it that as a team we're trying to do? What are our goals? What are the values we have in the team? What are the roles that we have? Who's responsible for what? And just kind of almost like a charter for your team. Very simple exercise. Whilst you're remote, it kind of helps you clarify what you're doing and why. And there's also something similar that is, from a personal perspective, I've used this before, and I think when I did some work with Salford, I suggested this for them as well, where you just on a personal basis, we can all say, what are this is the manual for me as an individual. What do I struggle with? What do I need to work effectively? How do I like to communicate? Do I like video? Do I like text, etc.? Just these sort of things. And we all share it so that we all start to know better what's going to work for each of us. Really simple questions to kind of check in with yourself on. Does everybody know what they're doing each week? Do they know what other people are doing? Do they understand why they're doing them? Do they understand how it all fits in together? If you've got some organizations will be working with kind of good project management methodologies or working in Agile or whatever, and this thing will be second nature. For other organizations, this is a real struggle. My sister works for the Arts Council, and they do, arts policy and stuff. And she said that now suddenly they're remote and they're just like, I don't know, I have no idea what to work on, because it's like, I'm completely lost. And she said they really had to just start to just break things down into who's doing what, when, why, in a way that they never used to when they were just sort of free flowing with each other in the office. But it helps them stay focused and it helps them get things done. We've talked about this already today, but going from one video meeting to another is exhausting. And if we have our days structured like that, we will lose our minds within the next few weeks. But equally, we suddenly, I think a lot of us are for the first time getting access to a lot of really cool different channels. So we may have like our WhatsApp going over here, or video going over there, or email going over here. Some of you may be using Teams, Slack, messengers, whatever. That is also exhausting. And I, whenever I do any consulting to teams, to organizations, I say, one of the basic things you can do that will make a big difference is just reduce down the number of channels that you use, come to a collective agreement on what you're using them for and why. So you'll never spend all your time just searching around and trying to remember where you saw something, and just shut off the things that are noise, so that you're not kind of getting overloaded. And then also just switch off. And I think we talked about this earlier, right? That we need to make time in the day where we're just off of all the computers, off of everything, because it does affect you. There are, this is a kind of just an example of like what a weekly work ritual could look like. And this is not something that is necessarily for whilst you're working remotely, but I think it's a really helpful one, right? Say you could play around with this, but at some point in time, you do a team planning. What is it everyone's going to do this week? What are the dependencies? What do we need to keep on top of collectively? What can we go off and do individually? You have somewhere where you can update the status on each of those things in a way, somewhere that everyone can see. You do a quick daily check-in so that everyone knows, if there's anything that they need to know, and those can be as long or as short as you need them to be. In real world, they sort of say they should be like, maybe 15 minutes or something like that. But in this day and age, maybe we need to make it sort of flex on that. And then at the end of the week, you have that reflection time where you ask those questions that we were talking about before. What went well? What didn't go well? What should we do differently next week, etc. Really simple, right? But by putting these, I think somebody in chat before said about routines, right? By putting these routines into the way that you work, you'll find this will be a lot easier. And this is actually the way that you would work if this was intentional remote working. And then the last one I was going to show is these simple, really, really simple. So I'm not going to get into like agile, this, that, the other thing, but I love this sort of simple Kanban. I'm going to say it is a Kanban board, but if you've ever seen something like this, if you haven't, it is just a thing of beauty. Like what's to do, what's in progress, what's done. Is there somewhere that you can keep all that information as a team so everyone can see? And you work to this at the beginning of the week and you check in on it at the end of the week. What are we going to do this week? What are we working on? What's done? And you can play around with it. You can call those things whatever you want, but just something to make it all in one place, shared, visible, so that again, we don't kind of get lost in our own worlds of our remote work. So that was my last little tool I was going to give you. And I am completely finished now. So I'm very pleased that people stayed on for almost like 50 minutes to listen to me. So thank you so much.
I think a couple of observations, and Pat's put a question in there around squad working and working in sort of agile teams, and some of the language around agile lends itself nicely to digital. But I will relate to the video meeting, and then stop. And then if that's, if you think about a working parent, if that's the only time you've got and you're all in video meetings, then when do you actually do the work? Yeah. So that's a bit of a personal reflection. So I do like some of the tools that you've had, the manual of me. So again, it helps you understand where people are at. It helps you with the, as you described it, the transparency, the openness, the authentic communication. Just going to see if anybody has any questions. I'm just looking down the chat box, and yeah, I think people have found that helpful. In terms of questions, then, has anyone got any specific things that you want to talk about? We've got about 5 more minutes, and then we can hang out a little bit after that if people want to. But yeah, very much opening the floor to questions. Don't all come at the same time, by the way. Okay. So I don't think we've got any further questions there either. I think I gave people plenty of time to respond, but I think what I will say is again the comment that you made about channels. I think once you've got your channels agreed, how do you maintain that? And somebody there has asked a question about how can you address poor performance during this time. I don't know what your thoughts would be on that. Here's a bit of a curveball for you, Eva.
Oh boy. I mean, I think the first thing has got to be to have a conversation about what's going on, because I mean, how can I put this? Is it poor performance, or is it somebody who's not asking for help, who needs it, right? And it could be either, and unless you try and figure out what the situation is that person is working in, you won't really understand whether it's a performance issue or not. If you know it's a performance issue, then I think then it goes into the kind of regular methodologies that the regular approaches that you would. But I think some people are not fully coming to terms with how difficult things are right now, and their performance is going to.
And I think for me, just to add to that, was it a performance issue before that, and is it still a performance issue now? And I think certainly everything that you have shared with us today, Eva, is really useful and relevant on how you would approach that conversation. So I think just as a recap, you know, the 4 thoughts were around sort of remote working is something that we're forced to do now during a global crisis. It's a challenging, and it's an incredibly challenging thing for people to be dealing with, for everybody, regardless of whether you've got kids or not, or you know, you might be socially isolated. And the thing around leadership is actually communication is the most important thing you can do right now. And then the final thought was around working remotely, taking tools, and you shared several really useful tools with us. So I think if there aren't any questions, I'd just like to take the opportunity to say thank you to everybody that participated with the webinar this afternoon. It is a beautiful sunny day where I am, so hopefully you will all enjoy the rest of your day today. On the slides there, you'll see that we've got some more content coming soon. So for those of you that joined us for the webinar with Matt Smead around resilience last week, we were looking at turning that into something really practical for people to use. And actually, we're going to be talking with Eva around how we can take some of what we've shared and learned today and make that into things that you can all take away and do something practical with. So that's all from us. Thank you everybody for your time. And I was going to say safe journeys home, which is like a standard thing. Safe waddle back to your kitchen or wherever you are happen to be next. And other bite-sized modules to look out for. We're looking at doing some work on physical and mental well-being. Earlier on today, we were talking about coaching and how we can support that. So again, if there are topics that folks want us to really work on, and if you're finding these useful, then please share feedback through either email to Alana, to Pat, to Sharon, myself, and the team at Northwest Employers. But yeah, that's us done for today. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you.
Right.